So thank you all for joining us this morning. I know that the last few months have been quite stressful for me, and I know how valuable time always is, but has become especially during this pandemic. So we really value your presence here today with us, and I would like to begin with a territorial acknowledgement. And I feel like that's been easier to overlook for some of us when we're operating more virtually, right, in this space that doesn't exist, but our feet still touch ground somewhere. And so I'm located on the ancestral traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So I live on campus, and I feel very fortunate to have been able to make my home here. So please take a moment to reflect on and acknowledge the land upon which you are currently situated, since virtually, we're all sitting in different places. So I'm going to begin by just introducing the purpose of this session today and some of the key people who have been involved. So the purpose of the session today mainly was to share findings from a research study that was conducted over the past year in the Lower Mainland. And I want to introduce a few of the people that have been involved. So I led this project. My name is Suzanne Huot, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at the University of British Columbia, where I also co-direct UBC Migration, which is the Research Excellence Cluster, with Antje Ellerman. So, as an occupational scientist, I'm interested in how people's engagement in everyday activities shape their daily lives and their experiences. And I'm curious about the different barriers and facilitators that shape their capacity to socially participate in the community. So as a migration scholar, I specifically study immigrants and refugees' experiences of daily occupations and how these experiences are shaped by the broader social context that influence their integration into the community. So I worked on this project with a few graduate students and research trainees, including Mélodie Onen-Delmar, who was involved at the very outset of the project and helped recruit a few participants and conduct a few of the early interviews, as well as Atiya Yekka, who coordinated the project and helped to complete the bulk of the data collection. So some of you on the line might have interacted directly with her. Her help was invaluable to completing this project. In a few moments, we're going to hear from Jacqueline Brower and Alex Tam, who are two students completing their master's in the occupational therapy program. And they completed an analysis of all of these data for their capstone project that's also going to be presented at an upcoming student-led conference that will take place virtually on July 29th. So if you're interested in topics around health and well-being and occupation, there's another virtual conference you can attend if you're interested to hear more about that work. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the support that I received from UBC Migration in coordinating today's session, including Sean Lauer, who's our community liaison and leader of the Community University Partnerships Working Group, Douglas Ober, who's the research coordinator for UBC Migration, and Saguna Shankar, who's a doctoral student assistant, who helps us really with everything. I'm going to provide a little bit of background about the study to give you some context for the presentation that the students will be delivering. The study's title was Determining Community-Based Outcomes for Successful Integration of Immigrants and Refugees in Metro Vancouver. So I don't know if it's because I'm French, but I tend to use a lot of words to describe things. It's a really long title to say that I was interested in, again, people's daily lives. But also, when I was doing my PhD and I was reading government documents, there was a lot of emphasis on this idea of successful integration. And I was curious, what was meant by that? Who was defining success? How were they defining success? And how did that discourse around successful integration trickle down to shape what kinds of services were offered, right? So how did we aim to enable success for people joining our communities? And then what was silenced or absent or left underfunded as a result of that? And so as an occupational scientist who's interested in really all of the activities of daily life, I wanted to know from a community standpoint, how did we see what success was and how were we able to enable that or not, given the constraints that our various associations and organizations face in terms of how stable is funding, what is funded, who is eligible for what is funded, and the like. And so my idea was to really get a sense of what was happening in the community, and then to get us together to talk about, what are some of the next steps? How is the current context limited, and what would we like to see? So what are the community-based outcomes of successful integration from a community standpoint? So if we sort of had more say in what was funded and what was done, what is it that we would like to see? So this project involved interviews with representatives from organizations and associations in the community who support opportunities for social participation in different ways. So I wanted to better understand, as I said, what kinds of things were available to immigrants and refugees in the area beyond traditionally funded settlement services. I wanted to learn about how people are supported in becoming involved in the community. And this led to a pilot project involving key informant interviews. So we interviewed 20 people who work in different organizations and associations throughout the Lower Mainland to ask them about these, beyond things like English language learning and employment counseling, what are some of the other opportunities that people have to make friends, to do stuff, right? So, and initially we had planned to do a half-day in-person think tank sessions that was going to be closed to only those who had participated in the research study, to discuss the findings, to offer feedback, and to plan some of those next steps. That was obviously sidetracked by the pandemic. That was supposed to happen on April 9th. So in the interim, we've moved to this virtual format, and we've opened it up to members of the interested general public so that we could have a broader discussion. If we were going to be doing it virtually anyway, and we didn't have to worry about, how many people was safe to have in a hotel boardroom, and there were no catering costs, that we could really open it up to whoever was interesting. So again, we thank you for your time, and we hope that this recording will be shared with others as well. So moving from here, Jacqueline and Alex will take about 20 minutes to share a presentation of what they found through their analysis, and the remaining time will be spent on discussion, which Suzanne will help us moderate. So as I mentioned, we ask that you please hold your questions until the end of the presentation, when we can then turn off the recording and just have a chat about it. And we really thank you for your time today and look forward to hearing what you have to say. So take it away, Jacqueline and Alex.
Great, okay. Thanks, Suzanne. I just want to check. Can you guys all hear me? All good, okay. Maybe I'll do that for you. Okay, so yeah, I want to welcome you to our presentation on service provider perspectives on enabling migrant social participation, and this was specific to the Lower Mainland. So cultivating spaces, occupations, and networks. My name is Jacqueline Brower, and my research partner Alex is on this Zoom as well. And we thank you, Suzanne, for already doing the territory acknowledgement. That was a part of the beginning of our presentation, but you did that, so thank you for that. So our research was completed with the supervision of Dr. Suzanne Huot and the assistance of Atia Yekta. And I think many of you received a poster which we created for the Canadian Association of Occupational Therapists conference. And just to say, if you did read that poster, there's a couple of differences in this presentation because we catered the specific presentation for service providers. Okay, so because the study focused on listening to service provider stories, we had the privilege to reflect on our own perspectives as well. and how they influenced our understanding. So we wanted to give you a similar opportunity to reflect on your own story before sharing our findings. Okay, so think of a time when you were trying to participate in a new community. It could be a new neighborhood you moved to, maybe a new workplace, a new club you joined. What were some of the activities that you did in order to participate? Where did you do these activities? And who did you do them with? And we'll have you just hold on to that as we go through our findings. So now we're going to further introduce ourselves and some of the biases that we bring to this research. So I was born to white Euro-Canadian settlers in Calgary, Alberta, which is Treaty 7 land. And I'm an occupational therapy student, as Suzanne said, from the University of British Columbia. I haven't experienced any international migration or any of the ongoing barriers of being a racialized person or a visible minority or a lingual minority. So I don't know what that's like. I have experienced, however, occupational disruption, so losing being able to do some of the things I love, as well as loss of social networks and loss of access to social spaces due to different forms of discrimination. I've also experienced institutions such as the university supporting my access to new social networks, new occupations, and new social settings.
All right. Can everyone hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, you're good, Alex.
Okay. So my full name is Alex Tam Yong Hong, or in Canada, Alex Yong Hong Tam. I too am an occupational therapy student from the University of British Columbia. And I've experienced international migration, having voluntarily immigrated here 6 years ago. I live in the unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation, and currently is an area where more than half of its population consists of immigrants. I have not actively engaged with service providing organizations for migrants, and all of my occupations, social spaces, and networks originate from UBC.
Thanks, Alex. Okay, so we're going to start by defining some terms so we're all on the same page. We're going to use the term migrants, and we'll use this to describe a person who's outside their country of origin, which means it's going to include both immigrants who more voluntarily settle, and also refugees who are forced to flee and resettle. Our next term is occupation. So we're in occupational therapy. We love this term. And what it actually is, it's a group of activities and tasks of everyday life. So it could be like cycling or cooking. And these are named, organized, and they're given meaning by both individuals and culture. So cooking means really different things to different individuals and different cultures. Occupation is also the core domain and the therapeutic medium of occupational therapy. So we use these meaningful activities of everyday life, and we hope for people to get back to them, and we also use them for therapy. And our next term is social participation. So we define this term as engagement in these meaningful occupations, but specifically that engagement leads to people having desired social roles and social identities, as well as the capacity to be involved in both formal and informal social settings. So I'm going to paint a little bit of a picture to describe this. So imagine you're at a social gathering and you're meeting new people. What do you talk about? So I usually talk about cycling because I love cycling, and that's this occupation that's very meaningful for me. And it helps me carry out some different social roles. So as a cyclist, it helps me be a friend because I cycle to my friends' houses. But also talking about cycling, it shapes the identity that I have in that social gathering. So it shapes how others see me. They're like, oh, that's a cyclist. I could talk to her about cycling. And it also shapes how I see myself. And then it opens up access to new networks and potentially new places that I can go on my bike with the people I meet there. So we also acknowledge that equitable access to social participation needs to be supported by policies, laws, and social structures. So from my previous example, not all people can necessarily access cycling if they can't afford the equipment, or perhaps their country's laws or social structures would frown upon a woman participating in cycling.
So now onto the rationale of our research project. So Canada's Multiculturalism Act states that the Government of Canada's policy is to encourage and assist business community, labor organizations, voluntary and other private organizations, as well as public institutions in ensuring full participation in Canadian society, including the social and economic aspects of individuals of all origins and their communities, and in promoting respect and appreciation for the multicultural reality of Canada. So notice that social participation, not just economic participation, is mentioned. So along with the mandates from the Multiculturalism Act, we also conducted this study in hopes that it could promote occupational justice. Occupational justice assumes that humans have a right to engage in meaningful activities and acknowledges that many face systemic barriers to engagement. So back to our reflective question. So imagine if you're trying to participate in a new community by making friends through swimming, but you can't speak the language very well. You don't understand other cultural references. You're worried about racial discrimination. You don't know how the lockers work. You don't want to talk about work because you can't work in your profession. You are exhausted from all the transition and you don't have many close friends to go back to at the end of the day. We acknowledge that some of you may have had this experience. Many migrants face inequitable access to participation because of language barriers, discrimination, and shrunken social networks. Occupational justice calls for people to advocate for social, political, structural, and institutional changes. So we chose you, service providers, because you are at an institutional level and have an understanding of systemic barriers and can be co-advocates with OTs, occupational therapists, in promoting occupational justice for migrants. Also, there is a gap in literature where many migrants' narratives are highlighted, but there are few studies representing service providers' perspectives on migrant social participation. Therefore, the objectives of this study were to explore how do service providers promote migrant social participation through occupational opportunities, and what are the perceived benefits and barriers to migrants' engagement in these occupational opportunities. We did our research from a constructivist paradigm, whereby we acknowledged that there is no single reality and that each service provider had a unique interpretation of their role serving newcomer migrants and enabling social participation. This qualitative research also adopted an interpretive description where it will help us form actionable implications as seen later in the discussion. As for participants, we had stakeholders from 20 service providing agencies that serve migrants and or the general population in the lower mainland of BC. Included were settlement-specific agencies, as well as those serving migrants, along with the broader population. So data was collected via semi-structured interviews that lasted 45 to 60 minutes, and data analysis was carried out using thematic analysis of steps of familiarization, generating codes, and constructing themes.
Okay, so on to the findings. So we created this conceptual model to capture our findings that service providers play quite a significant role in cultivating the social occupations. So you see that in the green circle there. Social spaces, so that yellow circle, and social networks in order to enable migrant social participation. So we're going to go through each of these circles. So for our first theme, we found that you, service providers, cultivated social occupations in two different ways. So the first one are what we call these preparatory occupational opportunities. And we found that these give newcomers the skills they need to engage in future social occupations. So sometimes these preparatory occupational opportunities were also kind of social, so they were done with others. But the purpose of them was to increase that social, cultural, and language competency in order for migrants to further diversify their networks. So many of you service providers, you spoke of offering language classes to increase English competency and to help migrants with their initial settlement steps. So in this quote, conversation circles are a great way because you bring people together on an informal basis to be able to practice language. And it's using settlement concepts, but it's a lot about just connecting, about talking to others. So the next one we found were these social engagement occupational opportunities. So this wasn't as much for the future engagement, but more so real-time occupational opportunities that were offered by youth service providers. So we found all sorts of different occupational opportunities. Volunteering was a huge one. Another huge one was food. So we chose a quote to represent gathering around food. So people love food, and all of the cultures that we work with, that's how they bond, you know. And so we do a lot of like group community kitchens. For our second theme, we found that youth service providers cultivated social spaces. And you also did this in two different ways. So the first one's around these physical spaces. So we found that you provided access to physical spaces where people could gather, such as access to social hubs. So in the quote, we do field trips from museums to cultural events to movies in the park. Anything that gets people out, gets them connecting. So this familiarized migrants with really important social spaces such as museums or movie theaters. You also provided space for autonomous organizing of activities. So the quote, we do offer a community room here, free of charge, and you'd be amazed to see people organize language classes there to teach their own languages to their community members. So along with these physical spaces, we found that service providers cultivated space through ensuring that the space is actually ideologically conducive. Many of you acknowledge that migrants face a lot of trauma, often discrimination upon arrival as well, and can experience a lot of distrust of institutions. So service providers use strategies such as trauma-informed programming, dismantlement of power imbalances, and community education on inclusiveness. So one service provider describes their ideology of mutuality like this: human beings with each other, trying to decrease as much as possible this power imbalance of we are the ones who are helping you, you are the ones who are receiving help.
So for our third theme, service providers cultivated social networks. So this meant they were increasing access to social networks of newcomer migrants with other newcomer migrants, neighbors, so these were people who live in their community, and gatekeepers, Canadian-born or more established migrants who can provide skills, knowledge, mentorship, and further network diversifications to promote social participation. So with other newcomer migrants, the quote is, so the idea is they can come, they're learning something, there's a facilitator who's teaching them how to knit. Again, they're talking, and in talking, they're set recognizing I'm not alone. And with neighbors, we partner with all sorts of other organizations, including settlement agencies. It's like neighborhood houses, sometimes community centers, sometimes also school boards, and that's where we have our classes. And with gatekeepers, as one person mentioned, a person living in Canada for a long time helps some new person with everything, with the English language, instruction, or taking them to places where they have never been. Okay, here's health center. There's a hospital. Here is a medical center. This is where you can go for a walk-in clinic. To take them there, or even to inform them that these are the places where you can take advantage of those services or go for your needs, can play a huge part. As seen from the quotes and our data, through social networks, newcomer migrants are less socially isolated, learning more culturally about their new environment, and have a deeper connection to their community. This in turn will better encourage and enable newcomer migrants to socially participate in their new setting.
Okay, so on to discussion. So as we interpreted our findings, we found that as service providers cultivated these social occupations, spaces, and networks, they kind of all dynamically interacted. And that's why we created the conceptual model the way that we did there. And we'll give you an example of that. So engaging migrants in the occupation of learning the rules and roles of swimming, then that would give them access to the swimming pool, so a space, and also to the network of swimmers that go to that pool. And then we found that if you change one, it influences the rest. So if a migrant can't afford access to a pass for the swimming pool, so they can't access the space, then they can't further learn the rules and roles of swimming, and then they can't access that network of swimmers. So we also found that cultivation of these occupation spaces and networks led to promotion of desired social roles, identities, and engagement in a variety of settings for migrants. So for example, rather than someone being identified purely as a migrant, a person who is enabled to engage in swimming then could be identified as a swimmer. And then at their next social engagement, they could connect with others through talking about swimming, and then they could further broaden their networks. So you can see how it kind of like dynamically interacts and one leads into the next. And they all lead to these social roles and social identities that allow for further promotion of social participation. So on to implications. Our primary implication is around advocacy. As we interpreted our findings, we found that both service providers, as well as occupational scientists and therapists, we seem to want pretty similar things, which is full economic and social participation for migrants in Canadian society. So we see the potential for collaboration in advocacy with each of these groups having some different strengths. So we see service providers, you're especially privy to some of the systemic barriers that are faced both by yourselves and by migrants. Often funding came up in the interviews, and specifically that there is more funding for economic integration versus social participation. And being privy to what are the systemic barriers is really helpful in advocacy. We also noticed that service providers have been incredibly creative despite some of the barriers in your institutional role of enabling migrant social participation. As far as the strengths of occupational therapists and scientists, we understand the role of occupation and its connection to justice. And we also understand how systems impact people's capacity to participate. For example, how spaces and ideologies can either constrain or enable participation. So we're hoping to see the use of this conceptual model that we created, as well as our research paper, to allow for increased communication both between service providers and occupational therapists and scientists, as well as between those two groups and policymakers, so that we can further promote Canada's Multiculturalism Act. We can further promote occupational justice for migrants. So kind of as a conclusion, Alex and I and the rest of the research team here is hoping for a country where all people will have equitable access to meaningful social participation that supports dignifying social roles and their desired identities.
So we would like to do some acknowledgement. This study was funded by the UBC Hampton New Faculty Grant, and we'll definitely like to thank and acknowledge the following people. Firstly, Dr. Suzanne Huot, our primary investigator. Tia for doing so much of the background work with the interviews and helping coordinate so many things. And of course, you, our service providing organizations that have agreed to provide us your insights. And yeah, so these are our references for our slides. We do have a lot of them. And thank you very much for listening to us and allowing us to share with you our findings. If you have more questions after the session, please reach out to our supervisor, Dr. Suzanne Huot. All right. Okay.
So on to you, Suzanne.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So I'm just going to